Hey, what's up? It's the HPR Chronicles Podcast with Shakur and
Smith.
Hope you guys enjoyed the show.
I like that way better.
That way better? Okay. You know, it's funny. I was watching some shows and people do it like that. Some people just introduce both. Some people like
I know
but I like to switch it up sometimes though because I think it's cool. Anyway, man, yes, HPR Chronicles Podcast with Shakur and Smith. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're a history, politics, and race podcast from a cool perspective. I'm a filmmaker from Trinidad and Tobago, and I travel a lot. I love history. Chris here is a veteran of the Army Reserves that works for the VA. He has a passion for history. We're about truth. We're not pro any race. We're just pro truth. And if the truth offends you, we're sorry, not sorry. That's our slogan. And we're just not sorry about it. Like I said, last week we talked about, the title was we should switch our names. Black America, let's all ditch our slave names. That's what we talked about last week. And this week we're going to talk about something that I'm actually interested in too, with the political parties.
Well, we're going to start with Republicans.
Yeah.
And then another, because I think it's going to take...
The history of them, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about the political parties in the U.S. I would think most people know about the Republican Party as it's one of the two major political parties in the United States. I would like to shed more light on it. It is sometimes referred to as GOP, which is short for Grand Old Party.
Right, that's right. That's what it means. Yeah.
It was founded in 1854 as a coalition opposing the extension of slavery into the Western territories. The party fought to protect the rights of African Americans after the Civil War. So I do have to say, when Republicans make that argument, they're true. That is true. It was started that way. So let's go into a little bit more history of it all. The founding fathers distrusted political parties, but it eventually happened because people had ideas on how the country should be run. People who supported George Washington and Alexander Hamilton favored a strong central government and a national financial system. They would become known as Federalists. However, Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State, favored a more limited government. His supporters called themselves Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans. This party would later become known as Democratic Republicans. The Federalist Party ended after the War of 1812, and by the 1830s, the Democrat Republicans had changed into the Democratic Party. They rallied around President Andrew Jackson. There was also the Whig Party. They were opponents of Jackson's policies, and by the 1840s, Democrats and Whigs were the country's two main political groups. In the 1850s, slavery became a major issue as the United States was expanding into new territories and states were joining the Union. The idea of slavery continuing was ripping apart political parties that a couple new ones were. It ripped apart the political parties that a couple more political parties were formed, like the Free Soil or Free Soilers and the American Know Nothing Party.
So that was the name?
Yeah, those were the weird names.
That's funny.
Yeah, since they didn't, and I can go into more in them in another podcast, but this is mainly about how the Republicans started. So
yeah.
So in 1854, there was a bill called the KansasNebraska Act. Essentially, the bill would allow settlers of a territory to decide whether slavery would be allowed within the new state's borders. It was proposed by Stephen A. Douglas. So in other words, as the states that they did have, people were moving west, and they just were like, do we let slavery happen or not? Of course, some opposed it and some didn't care.
Right.
Or some wanted it.
Right.
Or most wanted it. So by a little background, the act would eliminate the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The compromise was an imaginary line where slavery was allowed south of it, and of course it was not allowed north. Kansas was above this imaginary line, so by introducing the act, it would assume Kansas. So by presenting the KansasNebraska Act, because Kansas was the South state and Nebraska was the North, this would it was assumed that Kansas would just become a slave state and Nebraska wouldn't. Even though the act passed, it really failed because by that point, Southern states had started to withdraw from the Union, and by the time Kansas was admitted, so it was kind of the idea of it was just to keep things going and not causing problems, because one senator wanted to use it as a way to build a railroad from Illinois up to Nebraska. So he was trying to get something done, but he figured the only way to get this possibly done was by introducing something that would get rid of the other act.
Yeah.
Okay. So within the parties, that I mentioned, the Free Soil, the Whigs, the Americans, and Democrats, there were many people who opposed slavery and decided to form the Republican Party. They first had their first meeting was in Ripon, Wisconsin, in May 1854. 2 months later, a large group met in Jackson, Michigan, to choose the party's first candidates for statewide office. So, just kind of have to say that the goal of the Republican Party was not to abolish slavery in the South, but rather to prevent its expansion. Like I said, they didn't really want it to go to the new territories. They feared that slavery would become intertwined with national politics, which is kind of interesting projection.
Which is what ended up happening, right?
No. What do you mean?
Well, you said they fear that slavery would intertwine with politics.
Yeah, so slaveholding and stuff like that would be, so the laws that they would create would favor slavery type things instead of, so they just didn't want that to continue. And that's where the South decided to start succeeding out of the Union. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860 as a Republican candidate. It was in a large part due to the split between Southern and Northern Democrats over slavery. So because there was that split between Democrats for the North and South, that allowed the Republicans to have the power to get Abraham Lincoln to win. And he won by 40% of the popular vote. So before Lincoln was inaugurated, 7 Southern states succeeded, actually left the Union. And then that was what caused, of course, the Civil War, right? So we already have talked about Lincoln and how he, tried, how he initially wasn't trying to end slavery. Ideally, if he could have kept things the status quo, he would have.
Yeah, he would have, yeah.
So, but over the course of the Civil War, Lincoln and other Republicans started to see that abolishing slavery would be a strategic move to help them win the war. After the war, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863. The Republicans had majority in Congress, so then they were able to pass the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. And if you really kind of, as I was researching this and I kind of thought about it, like if the Southern states had kind of had went along with the KansasNebraska Act, that would have meant, again, everything along this kind of imaginary line would have been considered South, and most likely they would have become slave states, and the North would have been free. So we would right now be sitting in a potentially, like, if not the second or maybe the largest slave state in California, because it would have ran along that line.
It would have gone west too,
and it was sort of below
because slavery never passed Texas, right? It never went past Texas.
Correct, because there was no other states yet.
Right. Oh yeah, that's true. That's why it didn't. It was just those southern states.
Correct.
And some of those northern states, right? Yeah.
Yep.
The rest of the union hadn't been created yet.
Hadn't been started. So that's where, like, that's why it's kind of important to, the Kansas-Nebraska thing would have changed a lot if Southerners had actually went along with it, because they could have, like I said, they would have had Texas, and then after Texas, they would have just rolled, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and then California. So
crazy.
Yeah, so it was radical Republicans in Congress who passed legislation protecting the rights of blacks, including civil rights and voting rights for black men. Okay, so it was Republicans who did all that passing. It was those policies that made Southerners loyal to the Democratic Party for decades.
Yeah.
During Reconstruction, which we talked, the Republicans started becoming more connected with big business and financial interests because the North started to be industrialized.
Yeah.
The federal government had expanded during the war, and with the passing of the first income tax, this benefited the northern financiers and industrialists with increased spending. So there's just more money coming up north, right? But as whites started resisting Reconstruction, the interests of money, greed, became more important than the interests of blacks in the South. So with that switch, Democratic Southern state laws would pretty much just wipe out most of the Reconstructionist change. So this is kind of cool because it ties into, remember we were like, well, how did they go back? You started, like they had actually elected blacks, but then it went away. But it was once like the troops were taken out, once the interest of like the political parties was like, oh, we're just worried about money. They didn't care. So then, things
it's
started.
all about economics.
Correct. So by the early 20th century, the Republican Party's association with business interests was seen as a party of and for the upper class. So then, during this period, there was a rise of the progressive movement, which sought to improve life for working class Americans and promote Protestant values. Some Republicans, like Theodore Roosevelt, wanted progressive social, economic, and labor reforms. So even though most Republicans were all about the money, there were, like Theodore, who wanted to have push out progressive things like Social Security or something that and labor, like unions. The 1920s was a prosperous time, and the Republicans benefited greatly until the stock market crash of 1929, which brought on the Great Depression. Many Americans blamed the crisis on Republicans and was upset about their resistance to use direct government intervention to help people. Due to the Republicans' switch to big business, in 1932, Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to easily win. FDR ushered in the New Deal, which were relief programs, and the popularity for it was overwhelming. That allowed Democrats to dominate for the following 60 years. So from 1932 to 1980, Republicans won only 4 presidential elections and had a congressional majority for only 4 years. So
From what year to what year?
1932 to 1980.
Wow, that's crazy.
I know. So, and then the presidents during that time that were Democrats were Dwight D. Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, and Gerald Ford. But then the Republicans were I'm sorry, that was the Republicans. The Democrats were Republicans were FDR, Harry S. Truman, JFK, LBJ, Jimmy Carter.
Okay.
But that's Democrats. Wait a minute. I think Democrats. Okay. It was during these 6 years that the Democrats and Republicans' values started to switch. Dwight D. Eisenhower was a centrist Republican who actively supported equal rights for women and African Americans. The biggest migration was after the start of World War II, when white Southerners began moving over to the GOP because of their hate of big government, the expansion of labor unions, and support for civil rights, as well as conservative Christian values, which oppose abortion and other cultural war. So initially, black voters were loyal to the Republican Party after the Civil War, but changed to the Democratic Party after the Depression and the New Deal. So that's where the switch kind of happens. Which
We kind of touched on a little bit.
Yeah, and and I remember growing up and hearing my family, like my grandmother and mother and my aunt, tell me how my grandfather had voted Republican, and I was like, "What?" Like, you just knew.
'Cause back then, that was the party.
Yeah, and I was born in 1970, so especially at that time, you were majority of blacks just identify with being a Democrat.
Yeah.
So I never understood that. But now I sort of understand when my grandfather would have been old enough, it might have still been Republicans that were trying to help black people. But so I would like to add that even though Dwight D. Eisenhower became president as a Republican with his centrist views in 1952, the Republican platform was essentially conservative, called for a strong anti-communist stance in foreign affairs, reduction in government regulation of the economy, lower taxes for the wealthy, and resistance to federal civil rights legislation. The Republican Party had kept the traditional support of both big and small business, but gained new support from the growing numbers of middle-class suburbanites. The most significant addition to the party was white Southerners who were upset about the policies of integration by leading Democrats. So it was during the 50s and 60s that Republicans' views towards civil rights changed, which caused blacks to start supporting the Democratic Party. And then although the founders refused to recognize state rights and territories to practice slavery, and when I say founders, the founders of the Republican Party, just making sure. The modern Republican Party supports state rights against the power of the federal government in most cases, and it opposes the federal regulation of policing and education, which are traditionally state and local matters. Republicans advocate reduced taxes as a means of stimulating the economy and advancing individual economic freedom. They tend to oppose extensive government regulation of the economy, government-funded social programs, affirmative action, and policies aimed at strengthening the rights of workers. Many Republicans favor increased government regulation of private, non-economic lives of citizens in some areas, such as abortion. Though most strongly oppose gun control legislation, they are more likely to support organized prayer in schools and against the legal recognition of equal rights for the LGBTQ.
Yeah. So they switched, and the black community started supporting the Democrats more.
Yeah, because they started introducing policies that were about helping, being more social, and actually they picked up the let's have civil rights for blacks and women and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, but it's interesting how it flip-flopped.
I know. I mean,
you know what I'm saying?
Even maybe there's some little. That's pretty much it. I mean, I read the different things, and there were some more details, but it was
but that's pretty much how the transition took place.
I mean, once they became about the business and supporting corporations or big or small business, they didn't care about the community and the black community anymore. The Democratic Party said, okay, well, we'll placate to this community. Yeah. And the black people were like, well, they're more for us now. Yeah. So then they just switched. Yep. Wow. Which is kind of interesting because that's the argument I'm hearing now about how, and Trump says that about Democrats, like, you guys are fools. You've been following them all this time. And really, it's like,
he's like, they're not doing anything for you.
The switch didn't happen until the 1950s, 60s. So it's not like it was a very long time, but it was an important time because 1965 is when the Civil Rights Act was enacted. So if you really do take, the Democrats' views, it was to help not just only black people, but that was a huge thing at the time.
Right.
And I do have to say that it was Eisenhower, who was a Republican, who signed it, but he was still had the views of how the Republican Party used to be.
Right.
So, yeah.
Crazy. That's a good. I'm gonna go back and listen to that one in the gym, like I listen to all of them. You know, seriously, it's interesting, man. Yeah. The way the whole thing went down. You ready for this day in history?
Yep.
So that was our show, guys. It's HPR Chronicles podcast with Shakur and Smith. We're gonna give you this on this day, November 13th. The first one, you know what? The first four are pretty good, actually. So in 1775, during the American Revolution, U.S. forces captured Montreal. On November 13th. In 1789, Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter to a friend in which he said, "In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes." Mm-hmm. So that's where that term comes from, which I never knew. In 1805, Johann George Lanier, a Viennese butcher, invented a recipe and called it the Frankfurter. So that happened in 1805. Yeah, 1927, November 13th, the Holland Tunnel opened up to the public, providing access between New York City and New Jersey between the Hudson River. That's awesome, and I think we all have driven through the Holland Tunnel. If you haven't, you got to get to New York. It's pretty cool. Architectural marvel that happened back in 1927. To this day, I still think that's trippy how it goes under the Holland Tunnel. Yeah. So, yeah, that's it, guys. That's our show. Don't forget to subscribe on ISENT Group Digital. Keep listening where you get your podcast. We appreciate it.
We sure do.
And look out for next week's show. We have one more in there because I think Thanksgiving is on the 28th this year. Yeah. Can you check for me? It is? You know already? Okay. Yeah. So we have one more show on the 20th, and then we'll be off the following Thanksgiving week, and then we'll be back with you guys on the 4th of December. The year is coming to a close, my friends. So it's the HPR Chronicles with podcast.
Podcast.
With Shakur and Smith. Peace.